So there are some important points that I keep harping on about, because the clearer we become on certain things, the the more our thinking, the more that the changes in the body happen um, in line with these important points. And the important points are descriptions of how life is seen when the psychological identity has weakened and dissolved. So it makes sense that these points need to keep to be reiterated. So eventually we start to see exactly that. And one of the most significant points is to reiterate what the process is all about. What are we actually left with? What falls away? What is it in practical terms that we can say, oh, this is what I have after the process, or at least in a way we can say the process never ends in life. Life is an ongoing thing, and there'll always be change based on previous change. But there are some significant changes which really are the end of something. And so what do we have at significant points along the way? And so for this purpose, we can talk about a theoretical end of the process, knowing that actually there is more after that, but it's the end of suffering. So what is life going to look like? Because really the expectation that gets put in place can be a big problem if that expectation is out of line with what the change is actually about. And you might notice that I've used the word expectation, because if we end up with a belief about what the process is about, and that belief is not what it's about, then that is an expectation. We have an idea of how life will be or might be, which is just simply not available. So that's like any expectation. If we have an expectation on life is always going to turn out one way, and it's got so many moving parts. It's not going to turn out according to our idea. So any expectation of life is unreasonable, because life is not going to match it. If we have an expectation of something that's not available, or an idea of something that's not available, you can see that this fits into the category of something that isn't going to be matched. So on the one hand, we attitudinally need to say, well, whatever will be, will be. Like, I'm not even going to be concerned about if there is something that's going to be delivered or not. I don't even need to know about it. Now that's ideal. If you can take that stance, that actually means the end of seeking. That means living life unattached to what's coming next. If that attitude can set in, it's like, I don't even need you to describe what liberation is in practical terms, or I don't need you to put a concept on it, because I think having an idea of anything is problematic. And if someone said that and can actually live like that, I said, great. Are you able to just be in life with no expectation? And if the answer is yes, I can, then actually that means the end of suffering. So there's no seeking for that person. That's sort of like, yeah, what will be, will be. And I have no complaints, no expectations of it. What was. So no regrets or no looking back, holding on to an idea of how it should have been. And what is. So no complaints in the present moment about it. So, ironically, the description that I will give, because when we're seeking, we tend to have an expectation, and it's often the wrong one. So it's good to maybe have an alternate description to think about and see if maybe that seems more reasonable, more like what is potentially available. And when you listen to the description is a description that encourages the end of expectation, because the description is that what we end up with is the end of suffering. Nothing more than that. Just the end of suffering. And what is suffering? Suffering is guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So if expectation is there, if attachment to outcomes is there, saying, I won't be satisfied until I get what is at the end of the road. Or if we have an idea, or liberation is bliss, liberation is oneness, liberation is union with God, liberation is knowing the universe. So if we have an expectation that I need that which is not here to be here, that's suffering. So how can there be what is described as the end of the process if what is described at the end of the process is the end of suffering? How can it be if we have an expectation? So this is the catch-22. So anyway, I want to try and say something that basically gets rid of the fancy ideas. Fancy ideas that have most likely been turned into expectation, something we're longing for, something we're waiting for. And one of those, or a part of those ideas is this notion that it's an event that's going to happen spontaneously in a moment, and I'm going to know myself completely differently in a way that is very much not a human being. And I would say, well, the process, the seeking process takes time, and all sorts of ways of experiencing and seeing life will happen along the way. There'll be times when we see synchronicity everywhere, and we're convinced that life is all orchestrated just for me, that God has a plan and is delivering exactly what is needed at exactly the right time. And we're convinced about that because that's how life is playing out. That's how it feels. That's all that makes sense because of all the synchronicities and coincidences and amazing feelings and that we're having. And there'll be other times when we know ourselves not as the body, where the state of daily living changes to a much more ephemeral state, where we might know ourselves as timeless and formless awareness, where the body is an object and thoughts are seen as objects just arising. There's all of that. And if I'm asked to describe my experience of being in life, I'd say, you know, I can't say anything than life is pretty much the same. Still get out of bed, still feel like I'm a human being with aches and pains sometimes, goes and has lunch or breakfast and gets tired doing physical work, gets tired in conversations with people, has conversations with people, goes to the shops. So pretty much ordinary human experience, being a human in a world of form. I have to open the car door and the body gets into the car door, and then the body is driving it and feels like I am the body driving the car. But a whole load of feelings and thoughts that used to fill the space aren't there. And they're only it's only noticeable that they're not there if one remembers what life was experienced like when they were there. And one remembers that experience of life, which was sort of not feeling at ease with life, not feeling at ease with oneself, was because there was a whole narrative going on, a whole series of narratives, always changing depending on the topic. Same principle at the base of the narratives: guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. And in relation to different activities, different people, different jobs that have delivered outcomes that are good or bad. And that falls away. And then life is not uncomfortable, because those feelings, those thoughts created a sense of uncomfortableness. They infused a color into life, which was the color, was the color of uncomfortableness. It's a hue, a tint of uncomfortableness. And then that uncomfortableness tended to drive the activities, the way we behave, and you might notice that the activities were engaged in because that uncomfortableness was saying we need something different. That, life is uncomfortable the way it is. Let me try and get something different. I'll go out and meet with friends because I'm bound to feel better about myself in that situation. Or if I go out and try and get something I don't have. And as the uncomfortableness falls away, then thinking life needs to look a certain way, thinking that we need outcomes in order to feel good in life, slows down. And then we realize, I don't need to spend my time doing all of that. Actually, it makes me tired. It wasn't as enjoyable as I thought. And so the way we spend life might change. The activities we participate in might change because certain feelings, certain thoughts fall away, and therefore those activities aren't, we're not motivated to move in that direction anymore. But that doesn't change the fact that we're still a human being, that instead of getting in the car to go out to a party every night, we now get in the car to go to the shops to get groceries like we did before, and don't go out to the parties, for example. But the fact that we have to get into the car to get the groceries still means we more or less are the same entity that was here before, just motivated differently. And we find there's no complaints in the present moment, except for complaints about things, complaints that might improve the circumstance. So if someone keeps putting the air conditioning on too high, you might say, it's keep putting it up at the high level and it gets too cold. And if that doesn't change, then you realize, and even when that happens, there is a sort of, not an attitudinal complaint, it's a request to change it, but without an attachment to the outcome. And there is a flow, I guess, that wasn't there before. A flow where we tend to do things that we feel like doing, do things that need to be done given our circumstance without a resistance. And so that without a resistance is what creates a sense of flow and a sense of, this is my life. And there can be a sense of, it's a privilege to be alive. Like, how amazing to be alive, simply because there isn't the feeling that says, I don't want to be alive. That uncomfortableness, that heaviness tends to be something that creates a sense, I don't want to be alive. And it's just a removal of a whole range of thoughts and feelings that sometimes drive our behaviors and our activities. And that falls away. What we're looking for needs to be something continuous. This is one of the things that is overlooked when we assume it's about something much grander than what I'm describing. Most of the things that we might have in mind are not available on a continuous basis. And we can realize that they're not available on a continuous basis once there is a shift and a shift to what is available on a continuous basis, this peace of mind, the end of a certain way of relating to life. Then it becomes clear that these notions of, let's say, bliss, enlightenment is continuous bliss. It's just seen to be not reasonable for the human being to be in bliss all the time. If it is, if you go into some state of some sort of samadhi where you are not interacting in life. Because then the circumstance of life, which is a mix of pleasure and pain, isn't there to make bliss unreasonable in certain situations. So it really, to me, it makes sense that the emotions, the range of human feelings are still going to be there. If something goes really, really wrong, I mean, unfortunate circumstance happens, it just doesn't make sense that you're going to be feeling ecstatic. It's completely out of line if we're talking about alignment with life. To imagine feeling good all the time, and feeling good to the extent that there's a feeling of ecstasy all the time, just doesn't make sense. And often we tend to make this mistake because we will have experiences that can last for certain periods of time that do have that component in it. And then when it falls away to be replaced, to come back again, we think, oh, well, it fell away and that's just an anomaly and it won't fall away sometime. And because I had it for 5 days and then it fell away for a day and it came back for 3 days, that's proof that it's all about that bliss, because it'll come back the day or two when it fell away, I just forget about that and just look at the 5 continuous days it was there. And then it came back for 3 continuous days. And the fact that it hasn't been there for 3 months now doesn't matter. That's just because the process isn't complete. And when it's complete, it'll be there continuously. That's why we tend to think it's about that, because those states and experiences come into our life. And then we think, okay, this is not normal. So this must be a result of the seeking, and this must be the fruition of the seeking. I'm not doing a very good job of convincing anyone today, I'm sure. But when the absence of suffering, this peace of mind is understood, and we understand that it is the end of expectation, the end of uncomfortableness with oneself, the end of blame with the other, it makes so much sense that that is the only continuous happiness that could possibly be available in a world of change. A happiness which is simply the non-arising of a feeling that life is not right. Of course, that's human happiness. And it's available on a continuous, unbroken basis. It's just what we find is the self, the human makeup, when a certain attitude to life falls away. And if someone were to ask me why does blame no longer arise? Now, you might expect me to say, well, it's because the belief in personal doership has dissolved. And therefore, if I can't see the other as the doer, I can't see life being different in any moment, then blame doesn't make sense. And so the root of the blame has fallen away, and it doesn't happen. That might be what you would think my answer would be. And that's not entirely not acceptable as an answer. It's the answer I put forward as the rationale as to why the belief in doership is not in line with how life works and why it can fall away. However, if God came in and said, hey, Roger, the other is the doer, and from a particular angle, we can see that they are not the doer. And from another angle, we can say, well, the human being is the body, which is a result of genes and up-to-date. Even though the human being isn't in control, they are the one doing it, because the human being is in part the body. So in part, the human being is the doer. Attitudinally, it doesn't make sense to blame anyone for what they're doing because we know that they couldn't have done it differently, but they did it. As in, they functioned that way, that delivered the pain to me. So if God came in and said, they are the doer, my blame wouldn't come back. Why? Because it's not optimal. It's like, why would I blame them? Blaming them is an attitude to what has happened. So once the body has gone through a process where, through whatever means, life has convinced the body to stop that habit, and then the body has realized that it's possible to live life, experiencing the flow of life, what the other does, without the commentary, without the blame. And so life has delivers a feedback loop of experience that is, without blame, life is comfortable, even when the other, steals something from the car or doesn't pick me up on time, or whatever. There is the pain of the situation, and without blame, it's comfortable. There's no uncomfortableness. So once life has essentially removed the habit using whatever mechanism it does, and the mechanism might be the explanation that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer. That could be the crutch, let's say, that allows the thinking of doership to get cut off, which is essentially the weakening of the habit. And then there's the experience of living without that additional attitude to circumstance. And we find that obviously life carries on. You continue to function biologically. The other continues to function biologically. Circumstance happens. Outcomes happens. They're pleasurable or painful. And we stop there. The secondary movement of attitude has been disabled. So then God comes in and says, but they are the doer. And I say, oh, well, okay, fair enough. They can be the doer. I'm not going to blame them, because if I blame them, I know it's just disturbing my otherwise comfortable experience of life. So if someone wanted the real end result reason, as far as I see it, the most reasonable reason is as to why blame doesn't arise. I say because it's not optimal. The body, the person, the human being, the intelligence, whatever you want, understands that is a suboptimal response to circumstance. It is a response to circumstance that creates a layer of uncomfortableness on top of the pleasure or pain of life. Expecting life to look look a certain way is also suboptimal. If someone says that they're going to, out of the blue, they say, oh, I'm going to deliver this piece of equipment round to your place. I don't need it anymore, and I don't want anything for it. And let's say it's something that I've always thought would be great to have, and I can't afford it. And then someone comes and says, yeah, I'll give it to you. I'll drop it off in 5 days' time. My attitude to that is, oh, that's fantastic, assuming it gets here. Which I know that the person has said they're going to give me this piece of equipment. And I know anything can happen. They might get hit by a car on the way out of the house, and then in their estate, the piece of equipment is there and it is not given to me. That can happen. They can bump into another friend that they know and maybe has a certain circumstance that means that they end up giving it to them instead and come back to me with an excuse saying, I'm sorry, but I realized I needed it. I can't give it away. I'm sorry to disappoint you. That's okay. I understand. So expect the unexpected until it's right in front of you. And then you see that what you didn't expect manifested in front of you. Not some magic manifestation, but because the person brought it round in a trailer and dropped it off because it was surplus to their requirements. They knew you liked it or could use it, and had an urge to offer it. What I mean is, if you get offered a job, and it's your dream job, until you're actually sitting at the desk, be aware that a pandemic might hit. It's really, in a way, if we can see that, if I expect these things, when it doesn't happen, I'm going to feel really disappointed. If I believe that those things are what I need in order to be complete, when I don't get them, I'm going to be disappointed on a level of myself, on a level of, this is an attack on who I am. If we can register this, then it's these simple movements like, don't expect it, because people have a habit of changing their minds. Like, understand human nature. Human nature is people don't always do what they say they're going to do. So if you sign a lease for a rental property you have, or you are signing a lease to rent a property, understand that the other person may not honor the agreement in the way that it's written down. And then you say, but we agreed. Yeah, but God had a different plan. So if we start to see these things, we go, oh yeah, you and I have a concept about how life will be in 30 days' time when I'm meant to take over the lease, or when you're meant to move in. But God might have a very different plan. There was a time when I used to say that I'd write all my plans in pencil, in 4H pencil. So I could see them if I need to. I can really look at it to see them. But if I need to rub them out, they're very easy to rub out. The 4H pencil, which is a very light pencil, basically it's sort of saying my plans are written in pencil. It means they're held very lightly. Shame or guilt. If we get angry, or if we behave a certain way in relation to a transaction or something like that, it isn't, let's say, it's not going the way we would like. Someone wants to pull out, and then we threaten them with some sort of some action or some underhanded, or not necessarily underhanded, but we start getting tough in our interaction with them because we really wanted to turn out the way we wanted to turn out. And at that point in time, that seems what's most important. And then in hindsight, we might look back and think, oh, really, I let my colors shine through there. And we might feel, shame about how we acted and what the other person thinks about me. And then they've told all of their friends. And so now people might be talking about me and going, can you believe what he, how he dealt with that situation, insisting on the situation when the person's circumstance was so unfortunate. And instead of looking at the circumstance and adjusting the agreement, he insisted. And so now I realize everyone is thinking badly of me. And I'm feeling regret about how I functioned, my behavior. What that does is it creates this uncomfortableness. Now, the fact is that, yes, maybe you look back on it and you can say that was, pretty much driven by whatever it was, attachment to outcomes, let's say, or driven by the fact that I have principles. If you agree with if you make an agreement, then that's it, you have to honor it. Whatever the reason is, you might look back on it and feel bad about it, but it happened. And there's consequences to that. No one wants to do any deals with you now. You've been black banned. That's a consequence. So you have to put up with the consequences. They're going to be pain in the moment. So you might realize, insisting on that led to this really much more unfortunate situation where you got that, but you missed out on good relations and maybe, let's say, a flourishing business because now no one's dealing with you. That's, that's just a consequence of what happened. Feeling, holding on to that and regretting it and feeling shame adds a whole extra layer on top of the unfortunate outcomes, on top of the circumstance and the consequences of what happened in the past. So as we see that way of thinking about it is delivering a suboptimal experience, we might sort of say something might come in and cut off that way of thinking about ourselves, way of thinking about what happened. Now, there needs to be some rationale that comes in and aids the cutting off, makes it make sense for that cutting off to happen. So it could be as simple as it's not changing the situation and it's making the situation it's not making the situation, it's making how you are feeling about yourself and feeling in life much worse than just the pain of the lost income, let's say. So it could be as simple as that. And it's saying, well, really this thinking is not valid because it's making things worse. If we have another rationale that says, for example, you really couldn't have functioned differently. You were brought up in a certain environment, and that environment became part of how you are, where you were not, let's say, very compassionate, and what to do. That's how it makes sense that given your past, that's what happens. So that might be additional motivation for a cutting off to happen. But it really is about identifying what sort of thinking, what sort of relationship to life, what sort of relationship to outcomes is delivering this load of uncomfortableness on top of the pleasure or pain of the circumstance. And as we go through looking at all of the different manifestations of uncomfortableness, different manifestations of suffering, guilt, which is looking at those actions that happened through me that delivered a certain outcome, where we have regret and a sense of unworthiness or embarrassment, a sense of shame. That's one of the 5 different forms. Then you have blame and resentment and hatred and jealousy, envy. All of that is under blame towards the other for who they are and what they might have done. And pride, this sense of superiority and look how good I am, I'm better than everyone else, is in relation to those actions that are positive that happen through us. And that attitude is still based on, it's still an attitude towards life that prevents us from being free of this attitude that creates an uncomfortableness. It's a less intense suffering until we really realize how it permeates into our life. Then we start seeing how the pride is different, but really still quite disturbing. Worry and anxiety. Now, the worry and anxiety really needs us to start seeing that the worry, the anxiety is like an energy that comes in and it overwhelms us. It forces us to feel like we are very vulnerable and that some very unfortunate things are going to happen. And maybe we might start to see that these things don't actually turn out most of the time. And yet the feeling says it's definitely going to turn out that way. So one of the things we can learn is that this feeling is very convincing and it's not the truth. And so if you can become familiar with the fact that it's very convincing in the moment, it feels completely true, and yet in hindsight, you get to see that it's telling you a lie. That may be the beginning of an ending or a cutting off of anxiety, or at least a lowering of the involvement in it, the believing it. So it can be there, and then something inside of you can say, this is a feeling that is tricking me. As opposed to if we haven't had clarity towards the feeling by seeing that what it says is going to happen actually doesn't turn out, then when the feeling is there, we are completely blindsided by it, completely convinced by it, and it's there and we are fully invested in the outcome that it says is going to happen or has already happened. It's already happened and you're just waiting to find out about it. And so we then might still find that the anxiety comes in, but a part of you now says, okay, it's here, but it's just a noise, like a noisy child that isn't telling the truth. And so I'm not going to listen to it as if it's telling the truth. Blame towards the other is another form of this attitude to what happens in life. And one of the most helpful realizations that we can have towards, in relation to blame towards the other, a realization that helps us, helps the blame get cut off, is to realize how hypocritical we are when we blame, how, what's the word? So it's in line with the saying, we need to start adopting the wisdom in the saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Which really means we can't do something ourselves and then be angry with someone else doing it. So if you find yourself blaming a fellow driver for cutting you off, you might realize that yesterday you cut someone off because you misjudged where the turn was and you had to move across a couple of lanes very quickly and cut someone off because you didn't look in your rear vision mirror and see them. They were in a blind spot and you pulled over and cut them off. And you realize, oh, I do exactly these things many times. Often it's not even personal. You know, I didn't cut them off because I wanted to annoy them. I cut them off because I didn't notice they were in my blind spot. So it's completely impersonal. And here we are. One of the good things is if you ever get afflicted by or not an illness, let's say, or a stiff neck or something like that, and you're driving and you start realizing that as people get older and their body stops being as flexible and easy to turn around, you start driving as you see older people driving. And you might find that you bump into things when you're reversing simply because it's painful to turn your head and look in that direction, so you don't get as much view as you would otherwise. You might find that you have a brain fog that you hadn't experienced before, and then you start realizing, oh, you know, the some older drivers that are experiencing these phenomena, that's why they become less competent in driving. And so if that happens to you, and you see that you can't help it, when that's the case, you become less competent at driving. Then there's an appreciation for why these things happen. A good one is in relationships. This is quite a personal one. I guess it's much more about emotion, so it's harder to understand. But you know, if you've found yourself attracted to someone else while you're in a relationship, and you find yourself attracted to someone else to the extent that the relationship needs to end and you feel like you need to pursue a new relationship, you might appreciate how strong those feelings can be. And so if you're then on the other end of the receiving end one day, where someone says, look, I'm really sorry to tell you, but you know, last week I met someone and there are these feelings and I feel like I need to end our relationship and pursue something different. Now, that's going to be emotionally painful. I'm not saying that you go, oh yeah, no worries. That's no problem. It's going to be painful, but if you can understand how this happens and it's not personal, then you can feel the pain and have empathy as to how this happens, and I understand how this happens. If you found yourself in a situation where you've broken something of someone else's and you don't find the courage to own up to it, and you make an excuse, or you pretend to, you try and hide it, thinking they won't notice or whatever. That might be something in hindsight you look back on and you feel embarrassed about, which goes into more the guilt thing. But then if someone does it to you, you can go, I mean, it's not what you like. It's not what you you prefer for someone to lie to you about what's happened or try and hide something that's happened. You'd much prefer that you got the honest information, and then maybe the person says, look, how would you like to deal with it? I broke this. It was an accident. Tell me what your thoughts are on the situation. That might be the ideal situation. Instead, they didn't. But if you've seen how you can do that, maybe you don't do it anymore. Maybe you've learned, you've changed, but you can see, oh yeah, that's how I used to do it, for example. Then it makes it so much easier to relate to that as an understandable happening in the other person, through the other person. And it becomes less personal. It's taken less personal. It becomes more understandable. So then we go to extreme situations. There might be some of these things that you don't have personal reference to. You just never were like that. You didn't hide things, for example. You'd always be upfront. And so then we have to start seeing, okay, so you have a lot of examples of things that you can relate to. We often don't see this. We sort of, what I meant by what's good for the goose is good for the gander is we often have double standards, basically. It's okay for me to be like, but not okay for you to be like that. And so there are plenty of situations where hopefully when we open up this and start to see, we do find examples where, oh yes, I understand why the person would act like that. I know that happens with me. Then we're going to have the ones that we don't have an understanding for, a frame of reference for. So we see terrorism, or we see acts of violence. And let's say there's no way that I would function like that. So how do we apply the same principle? The same principle in theory is that if we were born differently, in different circumstances, then we need to see that we have the seed of a murderer in us. And it's good fortune that it never germinated. And if it did germinate that way, we couldn't possibly be different to how we... So the way we are, which is not a murderer, is because of good luck, because the seed germinated a certain way. And so there's no, with this attitude, there's no potential for pride and understanding that we could be the murderer or the pedophile or the whatever. Now, this isn't an excuse. This attitude doesn't change the situation from being painful, being atrocious, but it becomes understandable. So when I hear about acts of terrorism, I feel sad. It's like, families have lost people they love. It's sad that humans can have got situations that have snowballed into circumstance where certain groups hate each other with a passion. They just want to hurt the others. That's sad. We've seen it in terms of tribal feuds going back thousands of years, and it continues, and it's about trying to get what the other has, and then that turns into violence, and then it turns into revenge, and then the whole thing just becomes very unfortunate. And so life is full of very unfortunate and cruel, unfair situations, but they're understandable. Understandable based on particular people's makeup and the circumstance they find themselves in. And if we say, I can't understand how someone can take advantage of someone that can't defend themselves, or how someone could do this, I can't understand it. Well, I understand why someone can't understand it, because their makeup is saying, life should be all good. And that is understandable to me. But if we do see that people will function according to their design, and life has clearly created some designs that take life very personally, and that turns into hatred and a lot of violence, and certain behaviors follow on from that, then it makes sense. That's how life designed humans, some humans. And so then it's understandable, not pleasurable, not an excuse, but a rationale, a reason. And if we put that into the context that life is on a manifestation level, on a circumstance level, always going to be duality, which really means the interconnected opposites. So the flow of life is interconnected opposites, circumstances, interconnected opposites, a play of pleasure and pain, good and bad, health and disease, wealth and poverty, big and small, hot and cold. You can't have one without the other. And so given that we have humans that are capable of great acts of kindness in life, there are also humans that are capable of great acts of cruelty and evil. And so when humanity gets angry and rebels, when they're pushed too far, it makes sense to me. If people have been controlled and oppressed, then at some point that is going to build up to a point where there is an explosion. And that's just our destiny. Pride, the attitude of pride, of superiority, of thinking we know it, also, hopefully we get to feel that is getting in the way of being much more authentic, much more simple, connected, in a place where life as it unfolds is much more acceptable. And hopefully there's enough times where we realize we're wrong. When we insist we're right, we realize, oh, you were wrong. And then we start tapering down our vehemency at being right. We might start realizing that our judgment of the other, when the other is, underprivileged compared to us. Maybe the other is not as intelligent as us. Maybe the other is not as capable at certain tasks as us. And if we have this attitude of superiority and judging the other, we might start to see that infuses a certain feeling in our life, that when we start being honest with ourselves, is quite it's just an unfortunate way of relating to the other. And we can feel it each time we judge the other. When we stop judging the other, and the space just clears up. So a lot of this change in attitude is really linked to one, seeing that creates an uncomfortableness in life, and two, realizing that the contentment, the happiness in life is not really to be found in circumstance, is not at all to be found in circumstance, but rather in this changing of attitude. And so each time we find a movement outward, which is a comment about life, then hopefully something kicks in and says, you see, you're thinking that the circumstance is important. You're getting drawn in to circumstance. You're getting drawn into commenting about the other person. You're getting drawn into looking at how you acted in the past, how the other acted in the past. You're getting drawn into being in resistance to the fact that this person is now letting you down, which really hopefully comes up as you're being drawn into believing that your completeness, your happiness is to be found in outcome. And then we might come back, no, it's in the end of that attitude. And each time we come back, because we realize what's happening when we're getting drawn into circumstance, and we come back into silence. We come back into ourself and realize, oh, I exist in life, meaning I'm aware of life. Yeah, sure, the equipment that I thought I was going to get because the person said that they were going to give it to me and now they haven't given it to me. Sure, that's happened, but I am alive. And actually life, which is the experience in this moment, is of not having the equipment. That is life. And more important, I am life. Meaning I am, I exist, I have a life experience. And that life experience is really great when the uncomfortableness isn't there. When the uncomfortableness is there, we can't possibly say, oh, life is great, because life is not great because of the uncomfortableness. The uncomfortableness says life is not great. So can we see how if the uncomfortableness is essentially saying, I am not great, life is not great, you are not great, that's what the uncomfortableness is saying. That's what the suffering is saying. Then imagine what it's like if that attitude, that uncomfortableness is erased. It's not it's not quite saying, it's not life, it's not saying life is great as a new thought. But what we do find is in the absence of life is not great, we bump into life, into what is. And when we are centered outside of the pleasure and pain of life, then we're centered in ourself. And ourself happens to be a very unique thing, or nothing, essence. It's unique in the sense that it feels content with itself. It is self-contenting. Self-contenting, meaning doesn't require a piece of equipment. It is complete. It doesn't require a piece of equipment or a contract to be honored in order to feel content or complete. It is peaceful with itself, at ease with itself. So it doesn't require circumstance. It doesn't require the body or the person to behave a certain way, which in hindsight needs to be a way that we feel proud of or we feel pleasant about. It doesn't need that, because when we ground into the self that is outside or prior to the pleasure and pain of life, that doesn't mean when I say ground into prior to or outside the pleasure or pain of life, it doesn't mean that the pleasure and pain of life will, or that life circumstance will not be there. It doesn't mean that the waking state won't be there. It is grounding into the sense of self that is simultaneous to the waking state, but with a foot outside of the flow of life. And so that self is obviously not on the physical realm, because if it was on the physical realm, you can't step outside of the duality of circumstance, because the physical can only exist in the flow of life. So what is it? What is this self that can be outside of the pleasure and pain of life? The part of the human being that is non-physical, consciousness. Let's just call it consciousness. The aspect of the human being that is the core of the human being, you can say. That which is aware of the body and the form aspect of the human. So notice, I'm saying the formless aspect of the human is aware of the form aspect of the human and aware of the form aspect of life. So the formless aspect of the human is aware of itself. It's aware of the formless part of itself and the form part of itself. And it exists outside of the form dimension because it is formless. That's why our self is sometimes referred to as timeless and infinite. So within the realm of time and space, you can't be eternal and infinite. Eternal means the absence of time, and infinite is the absence of space. Infinite doesn't mean unlimited space, and eternal doesn't mean unlimited time. It means the absence of space and the absence of time. So I'm speaking about the form aspect of the human and the formless aspect of the human. There is a form aspect to life and a formless aspect of life. That's demonstrated by the different types of physics that we know about. Physics is essentially the description of what is, and there's a description of what is on the physical level, where there's time and space and the Newtonian laws of physics, mechanical physics. That's got to do with the the big things. So mechanical physics is physics on the macro level. And then you have the formless physics, the quantum physics, which is looking at the small things. And the laws that govern the big things don't govern the small things. And so when we talk about spiritual life in spiritual terms, we can talk about it on two levels. And both levels confirm what is most important as part of the realization that brings about the end of suffering, that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer. On the causality level, which is causality is in the realm of time and space. On the causality level, the body functions, outcomes happen, consequences happen, and the body functioning is based on genes and up-to-date conditioning that the human wasn't in control of. So on that level, looking back and blaming, expecting things to be different, doesn't hold up, because the causal things are unfolding one way because of causality. The infinite array, or the innumerable array of variables, are all interacting for life to unfold exactly as it unfolds. And so looking at it as if it should or could be different doesn't make sense. From the non-causal perspective, we see that life arises as a spontaneous appearance. And therefore, we can say that life doesn't follow laws of causality, and A doesn't lead to B, doesn't lead to C, doesn't lead to D, but rather A, B, C, and D all arise simultaneously. So from the non-causal perspective, there is no cause for the behavior that was seen to be not ideal. So if there's no cause to it, how can we have a commentary about it should have been different? That is just maintaining the story of causality. And not causality as I just described it, because the story of causality I described is causal, but it couldn't be any other way. And so the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome sees causality, but doesn't see that it is only one way. It sees it's causal and it should have and could have been different. So the real description of causality, life is on one level causal, but the causality is only one way, and the outcome in each moment can only be one way. Simultaneous to that, there is the interconnected mechanics that say that mean causality just doesn't exist, and life is spontaneously arising. So any commentary of I should have done it differently, life should be different, is not in line with the spontaneous arising way that life happens. And now you might be saying, how can you say life is causal and life is non-causal? Well, because life is paradox. And that's not just some spiritual seeking concepts. That's what's demonstrated and available for us to know in an investigation of life on a very pragmatic level. I mean, you can't get more pragmatic than science. And so science and physics really means the observation of things. That's what science really means. The observation and concluding based on the observation. And as a result of observation that is tested, because in order for science principles to hold up and to be accepted, they need to be constant, need to not fail somewhere along the line. So the science concepts that exist describe both causality and non-causality of life. And spirituality does the same. And our thinking mind, which is completely convinced that life is causal and personal and I'm doing it, doesn't understand how life can be paradox. So it doesn't understand impersonal causality and it doesn't understand spontaneity. And that spontaneous arising of life is available when we are completely present with what is, not believing thoughts that are telling us what is, seeing them as interpretations. Then, from the point of view of witnessing the present moment as a changing experience dependent on awareness, causality is just apparent. And really what there is this present moment that from the perspective of witnessing consciousness is free of time and space and is just an experience arising in consciousness. Everything is happening as an experience arising in consciousness. Form is apparent, time and space is apparent, and is not real from that perspective. It is just apparently what is happening as part of the teaching points at this by saying there is no creation, there is no dissolution, nothing ever happened, which is really pointing to the fact that what seems so real is an appearance in consciousness, and just like a dream at night, that it's there 1 minute and gone the next. And so if something can be gone, it means it's not real. If it's real, it doesn't change, it won't go. So from the perspective of seeing a dream, a night dream, as an arising in consciousness that appears and then disappears, in effect, you can say that if you start with nothing and end with nothing, then nothing plus nothing is nothing, which means nothing real ever happened. And within the unreal is the apparent real. And liberation is not escaping or the ending of the dream. It's not the ending of the apparent world. It's coming to live as the person in the apparent world, living as if it is real, meaning living on one level, living on the causality and manifestation level of the appearance, which is very much knowable and experienceable. And at the same time, having a foot, not literal foot, but a metaphor foot outside of the manifestation, and knowing the the formless, where none of it is real. And what that results in essentially is the dissolving of the belief systems that maintain this narrative of suffering. So maybe today's satsang has given you an idea of how, in this teaching anyway, from my experience, what is described as what is available is happiness through peace of mind. Happiness, which is the happiness that is there when the uncomfortable, suffering feelings in life fall away. And those uncomfortable, suffering feelings in life, which are a certain functioning of the human being or a certain component of the spontaneous manifestation, dissolve through a whole lot of different methods, some of which can seem contradictory, but in fact they're complementary. And life delivers these pointers, and then we start seeing glimpses of life from these perspectives. And as we start contemplating these new perspectives, which include things as simple as, oh yeah, I can understand why someone cuts me off. That starts coming in to the experience when someone cuts us off. And that thought can cut towards the other, as simple as that. Whereas previously, without us understanding why someone cuts us off, without us having that vision, the person cuts us off and all we have is the blame towards them. So in many ways, life brings in this change. And ultimately, it's a change where seeing life as something that could have and should have been different falls away. And what we see is what is. If seeking is seeking for truth, if someone wants to stick with that description, that seeking is a seeking for truth, then I'd have to say that one of the truth is what is. And the truth is disturbed when the mind comes up with what should be, what could be, what might be. We might as well just stick to the truth.